The cathedral bells of St. Augustine's had fallen silent 10 minutes ago. No one had dared to ring them again. Julie stood at the altar, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the bouquet of white lilies that the stems had begun to bruise beneath her grip. The flowers were already wilting, she could feel their petals curling inward, surrendering to the heat of 200 bodies packed into ancient wooden pews. The silence was the worst part. Not the absence of Tony, not yet, the silence. The kind that fills a room when everyone knows something terrible is happening but no one has the courage to name it. She could feel their eyes. Every single one of them fixed on her like she was a painting that had cracked down the middle. The priest, Father Callahan, a kind man with trembling hands, shifted his weight behind the altar. He had stopped reading from his book 3 minutes ago. His gaze kept drifting to the cathedral doors, then back to Julie, then back to the doors as if he could will Tony through them by looking hard enough. Julie's maid of honor, Sarah, leaned close. "Julie," she whispered, barely audible. "Do you want me to?" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. Julie swallowed. "He's coming. There was traffic. He texted me this morning. He said." She didn't finish. Because the text had said, *running late. Don't worry. Today is ours. 72 minutes had passed since she'd read those words in the dressing room, her hands shaking as she'd slipped the phone into the small satin clutch tucked behind the altar flowers. 72 minutes since she'd believed them. The murmurs started low, a current running through the pews. A woman on Tony's side, his aunt, Julie thought, let out a sharp, pitying exhale. Someone coughed. A child whimpered. The sound of a phone vibrating was quickly smothered. Julie lifted her chin. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people who had spent the last 3 years looking at her like she was something Tony had found on the street and was trying to make presentable. She was not going to give them that. Julie was 30 seconds from fleeing the cathedral when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden change in pressure, the heavy stillness that precedes a localized storm. Then the iron doors didn't merely open. They were thrown wide, the crash echoing like a gunshot against the vaulted ceiling. A man stood silhouetted against the gray January light. He moved with a terrifying, effortless grace, the stride of someone for whom rooms instinctively make space. He was dressed in a black suit so deep it seemed to absorb the light. Behind him, 2 men in gray kept watch with practiced, predatory eyes. He stopped at the altar. Up close, Julie saw a faint scar above his left eyebrow and eyes that held the amber glow of the stained glass with unsettling intensity. "Julie," he said, his voice a quiet bell in the silence. "My name is Young. It's time you knew the truth." The congregation sat paralyzed. Young spoke with clinical calm. "Tony owes me $2 million. 3 days ago he emptied your joint accounts. Your savings, your deposit, everything. He didn't leave because of cold feet. He left because he was running from me." "You're lying," Julie whispered, though her heart had already begun to sink. "Check your phone," Young countered. She pulled the device from her clutch. The screen refreshed. $0. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, but Young caught it midair with a blur of motion. He held it out, the glowing 0 an absolute verdict. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice defying the tremor in her soul. Young held her gaze, a small dark smile touching his lips. "Then she's mine." Chaos erupted. Gasps and frantic whispers filled St. Augustine's, but Julie remained locked in Young's orbit. He was a chess player who had just forced a checkmate, waiting for her to concede the board. Beneath the shock, Julie's survival instinct, the sharp, cold blade that had helped her rise from nothing, sliced through the panic. She looked at the 0 on her screen, the men guarding the exits and the ruin of her life. Then she stepped down from the altar. "Not here," she commanded. "If we're doing this, we do it in private." Young inclined his head. "Of course." He turned and walked out. Julie followed, her spine rigid, ignoring the 200 pairs of eyes burning into her back. Outside, she slid into the cool leather interior of a black sedan. The door closed with an expensive final click. "2 conditions," Julie said before the car even pulled away. Young turned, his face a map of shadows and sharp planes. "I'm listening. First, protection. If I'm assuming Tony's shadow, no one touches me. Not his creditors, not your people. No one." She paused, her eyes narrow. "Second, respect. I am not a possession or a piece of collateral. I am a partner in this arrangement. I have a voice." The car glided through the city streets. Young studied her for a long, measuring moment, as if weighing her soul against the debt. "Done," he said. Julie exhaled, a slow, controlled release of the breath she'd been holding since the doors burst open. She turned to the window, watching her old life blur into the distance, refusing to look back. The ceremony took place 47 minutes later, in a room at the back of a building Julie had never seen before and would never be able to find again if she tried. It was not a church. It was not a chapel. It was a small, windowless room with white walls and polished marble floors, lit by a single chandelier that cast everything in a cold, blue-white glow. There was a registrar, a thin woman in a gray suit who appeared to know Young well and asked no questions, and two witnesses Julie did not recognize. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Julie had changed out of her wedding dress in the back seat of the car. Young had produced, seemingly from nowhere, a simple black dress folded in tissue paper. It fit her perfectly. She did not ask how he knew her size. She did not want to know the answer. She stood beside him in front of the registrar, and she signed where she was told to sign, and she said the words she was told to say, and when it was over, Young reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a ring. It was not what Julie expected. She had braced herself for something ostentatious, a statement piece, the kind of jewelry that announces ownership. What he held out on his open palm was a single, flawless diamond, set in a band of white gold so thin it was almost invisible. It was stunning in its simplicity. It caught the chandelier light and fractured it into 100 tiny rainbows that danced across Young's skin. Julie looked at the ring. Then she looked at Young. "This doesn't change what this is," she said. "No," Young agreed. "It doesn't." He took her left hand, gently she noticed, with none of the roughness she had half expected, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. Knowing what she now knew about him, it probably had been. The registrar stamped the certificate. The two witnesses signed. The chandelier hummed its cold, indifferent light over everything. And just like that, Julie was married. They rode back in silence. The city had moved on from the gray morning into a gray afternoon, the kind of flat, featureless London winter day that felt designed to make everything look temporary. Before we dive deeper into this story, click the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from in the comment section. If this story moves you, share it with someone who loves a good tale. Do not forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Julie sat on her side of the car and watched the buildings pass and felt nothing, or rather felt everything at once, compressed into a single dense point in her chest that she refused to examine too closely. Young sat on his side and did not speak. He did not look at her. He looked out his own window, his reflection a dark ghost in the glass, and gave her the only gift he could in that moment. Space. Julie turned her attention back to the city. The ring caught the light every time the car passed a street lamp, a quiet, persistent flash. She did not take it off. She had made a bargain. She intended to keep it. The estate was not what she expected. Julie had pictured something cold. Something imposing, all iron gates and gray stone and the architectural equivalent of a warning sign. Something that said, "You do not belong here and we want you to know it." What she found instead, as the car turned off the main road and wound up a long gravel drive lined with bare winter trees, was something closer to beautiful. The house was modern, all glass and pale timber, set into the side of a hill as though it had grown there. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a valley dusted with frost, and the late afternoon light turned the glass to gold. Julie stepped out of the car and stood at the end of the drive, looking up at it, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. "It's not what you expected," Young said. He was standing behind her, hands in his pockets, watching her face with that same quiet, assessing attention she was beginning to recognize. "No," Julie admitted. "It's not." "Good." He led her inside. The interior was warm, heated floors she realized beneath her feet, and furnished with the kind of restrained taste that suggested money spent not on showing off, but on comfort. Soft leather sofas in dark gray. Bookshelves built into the walls filled with actual books, not the decorative kind. A kitchen that was clearly used, a copper pan hanging from a rack, a bowl of fruit on the counter, a coffee machine that looked expensive and well-loved. Julie walked through the ground floor in silence, taking it in. It did not feel like a cage. That was what surprised her most. For all her fears, the gilded cage, the golden prison, this place felt like someone's home. A real one. Lived in. Humans. A woman appeared, mid-50s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen and explained that she managed the household. Julie would have everything she needed. "I'm not a prisoner," Julie said before she could stop herself. Mrs. Chen looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real smile, warm and slightly amused. "No, Mrs. Young," she said. You're not. Julie flinched at the name. Mrs. Young. She caught Young watching her from the doorway, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been amusement or might have been something else entirely. He showed her to her room himself. It was on the second floor at the end of a long corridor, with its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the valley. The bed was large, the sheets white, the room spotlessly clean. This is yours, Young said, standing in the doorway. Entirely yours. I have my own rooms on the other side of the house. I will not come in here without your permission. Julie turned to face him. The late light fell across half his face, catching the line of his jaw, the dark sweep of his hair. He looked, in that moment, younger than she had realized he was. Almost uncertain. Almost. Thank you, Julie said. Young nodded. He lingered for one beat longer than necessary, just one, and then he turned and walked down the corridor, and Julie was alone. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked down at the ring on her finger, at the flawless diamond catching the fading light, and she thought, I have traded one cage for another. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't quite true. Because this cage had warm floors and good coffee and a woman named Mrs. Chen who smiled like she meant it. And the man who had built it had just looked at her like she was something worth being careful with. Julie did not know what to do with that yet. So she set it aside, the way she set aside all the things she couldn't process, and she lay back on the white sheets, and she watched the last of the light fade from the valley, and she breathed. The meeting took place the following morning in a study on the ground floor that Julie had not noticed the day before. It was a room that felt like the inner sanctum of a fortress, lined with dark, floor-to-ceiling wood paneling, its shelves holding leather-bound folders and crystal decanters of amber liquid that caught the winter light like liquid honey. The air smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and the faint, ozone-sharp scent of a storm brewing outside. 3 lawyers sat on one side of a long mahogany table, their faces masks of professional indifference. Young sat on the other, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Julie sat beside him, which surprised her. She had expected to be positioned somewhere peripheral, a spectator to her own fate. But Young had simply pulled out the chair next to his and said, "Sit," and so she had. His presence beside her was a physical weight, a grounding force in a room that felt increasingly clinical. The lead lawyer, a tall woman named Catherine Voss, with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she wore on a silver chain, opened a leather portfolio. She laid a series of documents on the table with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon. "The situation is straightforward," Voss said, addressing Julie directly. Julie noticed this immediately. The lawyer was not talking to Young. She was treating Julie as the principal party. "Mr. Young has assumed full liability for Mr. Donovan's outstanding debts. As his wife, you are now covered under his protection agreements. This means that any party seeking to collect on those debts, and there are several, cannot legally or otherwise pursue you." Julie looked at the documents. Names she didn't recognize were typed in bold, aggressive fonts. Numbers, staggering, impossible sums, made her stomach tighten. Tony's debts were laid bare on cream-colored paper like organs displayed on an operating table. It was the anatomy of a betrayal. How many people were looking for him? Julie asked, her voice sounding thinner than she liked. Voss glanced at Young. He offered a short, curt nod. "For separate parties," Voss said. "2 of whom had already made inquiries about you, prior to the wedding. They weren't just looking for the money, Mrs. Young. They were looking for leverage." The room went very quiet. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer against an anvil. "They knew about me," Julie whispered. It was not a question. It was the realization that her entire life had been a target she hadn't known she was wearing. "Yes," Voss replied. "They knew your schedule, your place of work, and your lack of security." Julie processed this. The implications settled over her like a second skin, cold, tight, and suffocating. Tony had not simply run from his mistakes. He had left her as a human shield. He had knowingly left her exposed as a distraction, a way to buy himself a few extra hours of head start while the wolves closed in on her instead. She turned to Young. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "You knew. Before the wedding. You knew they were watching me." Young met her gaze without flinching. "Yes. That's why you were there. At the cathedral. You didn't just happen to hear about the debt. You were tracking the people who were tracking me." "Yes." Julie sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, not just the danger she hadn't known she was in, but the fact that this man, a stranger, had seen the cliff she was standing on and decided to catch her. Not because he owed her anything, but because he had decided she was worth the price of the debt. Or perhaps because she was a strategic asset. She reminded herself that men like Young rarely did anything out of pure altruism. What are my rights? Julie asked, turning back to Voss. Within this arrangement, what can I do? Where can I go? Voss smiled, a small, approving expression that didn't reach her eyes. Anywhere you like, Mrs. Young. You have full access to the estate, to the city, to a car and a driver whenever you need one. You have a personal account, funded by Mr. Young with no spending limits. In every legal sense, you are a free woman. In every practical sense, you are the most protected person in this jurisdiction. Julie looked at the documents again. At the names and the numbers and the neat, elegant architecture of protection that Young had built around her. She picked up the pen Voss offered. The silver barrel was heavy and cold. She signed where she was told to sign, the scratch of the nib against the paper the only sound in the room. When it was done, she set the pen down and looked at Young. Thank you, she said. It felt like a surrender, but also a beginning. It was Mrs. Chin who let it slip, though Julie suspected the housekeeper was far too sharp for accidents. They were in the kitchen. Julie had taken to spending her mornings there, drinking coffee and reading. She was drawn by the warmth of the space, the smell of toasted bread, and the easy domesticity that felt like a sanctuary from the rest of the cold, cavernous estate. Mrs. Chin moved around her with practiced ease, her movements rhythmic and soothing. On the fourth morning, the conversation turned to the master of the house. He's different with you, Mrs. Chin said, her hands busy arranging white lilies in a crystal vase. Quieter. The air in the house has changed. Julie looked up from her book, a thumb marking her page. What do you mean? He watches you, Mrs. Chin said simply. The way he used to watch the monitors. Julie's heart skipped a beat. Monitors? You mean the security for the gates? Mrs. Chin paused. For the first time, something like discomfort crossed her face. She set down a stem and looked at Julie with an expression that was part apology, part relief, as if she were tired of carrying a secret that wasn't hers. He has security cameras throughout the estate, of course, Mrs. Chin explained. But before you arrived, he had others. Remote feeds. In your previous apartment. Outside your workplace. At the community center where you volunteered. The kitchen was very warm, but Julie felt a sudden, sharp chill. Her fingers went numb against the cover of her book. How long? She asked. Months, Mrs. Chin said quietly. Since before Mr. Donovan's debts became critical. He was studying you. Learning your patterns. He knew what kind of tea you liked before you ever stepped foot in this kitchen. He knew which books you left on your nightstand. Julie stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. The domestic warmth of the kitchen vanished, replaced by a sense of violation so profound it made her dizzy. Every private moment of her life over the last few months, every time she had danced alone in her kitchen, every time she had cried over Tony's absences, had been a performance for a hidden audience. She found Young in his study. He was standing at the window, the gray winter light casting long shadows across his face. He ended a phone call the moment she burst in. You watched me, Julie said. She didn't scream. Her voice was low and dangerous, vibrating with a fury that felt like live wire. Young set the phone down on the desk. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look guilty. Yes, he said. My apartment. My life. Every private moment. Young watched her face, his gaze steady. I needed to know who I was protecting. I needed to know if you were involved in Donovan's dealings. I needed to know if you were someone who would break under the pressure of what was coming. That wasn't your decision to make. You stripped away my privacy before you ever even met me. It was the only way to ensure your safety, Young replied, his voice maddeningly calm. If I had approached you sooner, I would have tipped off the people tracking you. I had to wait for the right moment to intervene. Julie stared at him. She thought about the wedding dress, how it had fit perfectly as if it had been molded to her body. She thought about how he knew exactly what to say to her in the car. It wasn't intuition. It was data. He didn't stumble into my life, she realized aloud. You curated this. You waited until I was at my most vulnerable so you could play the hero. I am no hero, Julie, he said, and for the first time, there was a flash of something dark and honest in his eyes. I am a man who protects what belongs to him. And from the moment I saw those men following you, I decided you would belong to the safety of this house. If you ever do that again, Julie said, her voice trembling, I will leave. I don't care about the debts or the danger. I will not be a bird in a cage with a camera in the corner. Young held her gaze for a long, unbroken moment. Then he nodded slowly. Understood. The feeds were disconnected the day you moved in. You have my word. Julie turned and walked out, her pulse drumming in her ears. She made it to the corridor before her hands started to shake. She realized then that the most terrifying thing wasn't that he had watched her. It was that he had seen everything, the good and the broken, and he had still wanted her here. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the wedding. Julie had insisted on going into the city alone. It was a test of her new boundaries, a way to reclaim a sense of self that wasn't Mrs. Young. She went to a small bookshop near Charing Cross, a place of narrow aisles and the comforting scent of vanilla and old paper. For an hour she felt like her old self. But as she stepped out onto the pavement, the illusion shattered. 2 men were leaning against a black car parked at the curb. They weren't wearing the tailored suits of Young's security. These men wore heavy leather jackets and expressions of blunt, predatory boredom. Julie felt the fear arrive, cold and immediate. She didn't run, she knew better. She reached into her bag, her fingers finding the emergency phone Mrs. Chen had given her. The larger of the 2 men approached. He had a scarred lip and eyes that looked right through her. "Donovan's wife," he said. "The one who got a promotion." "I have nothing to do with Tony," Julie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "His debts are no longer my concern. They're our concern, love. And since Tony's vanished, you're the only collateral we've got left. Mr. Young thinks he can just buy people off, but some things require more personal touch." He reached for her arm. His grip was like iron, bruising the skin of her wrist. Julie didn't scream, but she didn't move either. She looked him dead in the eye, and in that moment she saw a shadow fall over the man's face. Young didn't walk, he seemed to materialize. He was suddenly there, his hand closing around the man's forearm with enough force that Julie heard the bone groan. "Let go of her," Young said. The tone was so quiet it was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The man released Julie instantly, stumbling back. He looked at Young and the predatory boredom vanished, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "Mr. Young. We weren't told she was with you today." "She is always with me," Young said. He stepped forward, putting himself between Julie and the men. "You have 30 seconds to disappear. And you have 30 minutes to tell your employer that if I see a single one of your associates within a mile of my wife again, I will stop using lawyers and start using the methods you're more familiar with." The men didn't argue. They scrambled into their car and tore away from the curb. Young turned to Julie. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked at her wrist, where red welts were already forming. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. For a second, Julie saw it, the controlled violence that he kept tucked behind his expensive suits. "They didn't see me as a person," Julie said quietly as they walked toward his car. "They saw me as a debt." Young stopped and looked at her. "To them you are a number. To me, you are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale." He opened the car door for her, his movements graceful and somber. As they drove back to the estate, Julie didn't look out the window. She looked at him. She realized that while Tony had used her as a shield, Young was using himself as one. It didn't make him a saint, but in a world of wolves, it made him the alpha. The news came on a Friday. Tony had been found. Catherine Voss delivered the report in the study. Tony had been tracked to a dingy flat in Lisbon, living off the remains of the money he'd embezzled and a steady diet of cheap scotch. He was being extradited. "He's a broken man, Julie," Voss said. "He'll be in a cell for a long time. The trial will be a formality." Julie felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She had expected to feel rage or perhaps a sense of justice. Instead, she felt nothing but a lingering exhaustion. She excused herself and found Young in the garden, standing near a frozen fountain. "I want to see him," Julie said. "Before the trial. I need to look him in the eye." Young turned to her. The frost in the air seemed to cling to his coat. "I can arrange it. But there is something you should know first." He stepped closer, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Tony's debts are gone. The threats are neutralized. Legally you are clear. Which means, our arrangement has served its purpose." Julie froze. "What are you saying?" "I'm giving you a choice," Young said. "A real one. I have had Voss prepare a settlement. It's enough for you to move anywhere, start any life you want. You can walk away from this house, from the cameras, and from me. You would be truly free." The words felt like a blow. This was the out she had imagined on her wedding night, the golden ticket back to her old life. But as she looked at him, she realized her old life was a ghost. "You're letting me go?" she whispered. "I am giving you the choice I stole from you at the cathedral," he replied. Take as long as you need. Julie spent 3 days in a daze. She walked the perimeter of the estate, watching the way the light hit the stone walls. She thought about her small apartment, the fear she had lived with, and the strange, quiet dignity she had found here. On the third morning she found Young in the kitchen. He was making coffee, a simple human act that looked out of place on a man of his stature. He looked up, his eyes searching hers for the verdict. "I've made my decision," she said. Young set the mug down, his body tensing as if bracing for a physical impact. "I don't want to leave," Julie said. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Young didn't move. "Julie, you don't have to stay out of gratitude. I told you the debt." "It's not about the debt," she interrupted, stepping into his space. "It's not about safety either. It's about the fact that for the first time in my life, someone actually saw the danger I was in and stood in front of it. It's about the way this house feels when you're in it." She reached out, her fingers brushing the scar above his eyebrow. He closed his eyes at the touch, a shuddering breath escaping him. "I want to stay," she whispered. "But not as an arrangement. Not as a ward. If I stay, it's your equal." Young opened his eyes. The mask was gone. Underneath was a man who had been lonely in a palace of his own making. A man who had watched a woman from afar and realized she was the only thing real in his world. "Every day," he said, his voice raw, "I will learn from the fact that you chose to stay." He took her hand, his fingers warm and certain. Outside, the winter sun finally broke through the clouds, reflecting off the melting frost. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still secrets, still shadows, and a husband in a jail cell. But as Julie looked at the man holding her hand, she knew she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a woman who had walked through the fire and found someone waiting on the other side. It was more than enough.